Hey, everybody, welcome to the Aligned Love Podcast. This is the place where I am going to help you find the one thing that you feel is missing: healthy love. I am your host, Lauren Zoller, and in this podcast, I will share with you how to attract love, live in alignment, and elevate your deepest relationships. So, buckle up, get present, tune into your body, and open up to the possibility that you truly do get to have it all. Let's dive in. Emily, welcome to the show.
Lauren, thank you for having me. I'm so excited about this conversation.
Yeah, me too. And I know that it's going to be so enlightening for the women and the men that listen in. And we're going to be talking a lot today about navigating when to stay, when to walk away, when you're in a relationship or even friendships. I know that it's and in business situations too, there's always this question of when is the right time? And so we're going to dive into that. But I always like to, before we do anything, I always like to begin the show with an intention setting. And I really want you to actually set this intention today for how you want the listeners to feel as a result of our conversation so that they can keep that in the front of their mind as we're talking today.
Well, this conversation is one that can be so tender and it can be a little bit scary. And I think the one word that comes to my mind as we embark upon a complicated and really heartfelt issue is the word courage.
Mm.
And I want to hold that out in front of me today in order to remind myself of that word, but also to invite anyone listening to just be willing to open yourself up to a courageous next step, even though you might not be clear exactly what it is.
I love that. So courage. Courage is our word for today. Such a beautiful word. So tell us a little bit about your story. I know that you do help people in supporting them to navigate decision fatigue, which I know, I mean, gosh, I I deal with that all the time. And so that's a very specific niched place to support people. So I'm curious, I know it stems from your story. So can you tell us a little bit about how you stepped into this space of being so specific in how you help people?
Well, the reality is the studies say we make over 35,000 decisions every day. And I would like to question it, but I'm not doing my own research on it. So I'm just going to take the expert's word on that. And I think a lot of us feel that no matter your age, gender, life circumstance, social location, vocation, one thing we all have in common is we got to make some decisions. We cannot delegate them. We cannot age out of them. We can't graduate from them, and we're not going to retire from them. As long as we're living, we're making decisions. It's here to stay. And so I think the reality is, speaking of my own story, we tend, at least this is in my experience, we tend to write and teach what we most need to learn ourselves.
Mhm.
And the reason I'm compelled to meet people at this crossroads of this or that, stay or leave, now or later, is because it's the place where I feel the most chronically hesitant. It's the place where I have experienced a lot of decision fatigue. It's because this is me. And so I do spend a lot of my time um, as a spiritual director, which all that means is I spend time listening to people ask questions about their lives. And most of my training has been less about learning how to listen and more about unlearning all of the toxic ways we often tend to listen, which is to advise, to one up, to help. And so my role in this kind of conversation that I'm having, whether it's through speaking or writing books or hosting a podcast or even just one on one, is not so much to tell somebody what to do, although somebody may have just turned this podcast off right now, like, you're not going to tell me what to do. But it is to help you discern how might divine God, how might your most, your most, the deepest part of who you are, what are those answers that are already in you? And what
Mm.
might we need to help get out of the way in order for you to access them? And so that's really, that jazzes me. I never get tired of talking about it. And I also think that's the point. When we have a decision to make, we want more than anything an answer. But
Mm.
what I am, and I want to help with that, but I think that's secondary. I think what I'm most interested in is the person who you're becoming in this process of decision making.
Yeah. Oh, So needed. Even as you're speaking that out loud, I was having a conversation with one of my coworkers yesterday about this very thing that you're speaking about, because we are at my in my business, I'm in a massive, what I like to call, an up level. There's a lot of things that are crumbling and a lot of things that are coming to fruition within this stage of where the business is. And I remember, I mean, gosh, if I had you 5 years ago, I probably would have, you would have been, I would have had you on payroll, because there's something about that letting go and that trust and that lean into the divine that makes big moments and transitions like this, it feels really scary. It feels like death when it happens.
Yes.
And
Yes.
nobody's speaking to this stage of life that people go through. And it's going to happen. I was telling myself yesterday, I was laying on my yoga mat. I'm like, this is not the first time this has happened. And it's not going to be the last. And so helping someone navigate through that is just such a beautiful place to be. And so I'm really excited to dive in deeper. So I'm curious to know, even with that kind of in the forefront, let's kind of take it back to the basics. How does someone decipher the difference between their inner truth and or the avoidance of discomfort? So I know, personally, I'm still doing a lot of work here. It's really hard to decipher, okay, what's coming from in my internal truth, my knowing, my connection to divine, and what is me just kind of avoiding what I need to do in the discomfort dance.
Dr. Hillary McBride wrote a book called, oh, I've just lost the title of it, The Wisdom of Your Body.
Mhm.
And she talks about this very difference. And she talks about the importance of listening to our bodies. A lot of us don't know how to do that. But you're right. There is a difference between the peace that comes from doing the deeply right thing
Mhm.
and the relief that comes from avoiding discomfort.
Yeah.
And sometimes and the reason I brought up Dr. McBride is she says that's a whole life's work to discern that
Mm.
difference. So I am under no illusions of grandeur that we will be able to impart this to anyone in our short conversation, but I will say I think it's an important conversation to begin to have and an important thing to remember when we're talking about discerning what to do next, stay or go, because so often when we hear, for example, just trust yourself. You can trust yourself.
Oh,
Man, that's a loaded a directive
yeah.
because so many of us were taught that we can't trust ourselves. And or we think that means trust yourself to the exclusion of everything else or to the exclusion of trusting God, the people who know you the best, the story that you've already lived. Like there's a lot to but I think when I say you need to begin. What if you really could trust yourself? The invitation is to me, what if you also get to be a voice at the table? I think
Mm.
so often we discount our own fear, our own longing, our own desire, our own hesitations, because a lot of us think like, well, that can't possibly count. I need to outsource my confidence to somebody else because surely I can't trust my own inner knowing or what's happening on the inside. And so, my encouragement as we just get started in this conversation is to hold that question: what if you could trust yourself, not to the exclusion of all other data points? But if you could trust yourself too. And so I
Mm.
think that when it comes to knowing, is this door an open door or a closed door, fear and discomfort are often put in the category of, well, this must be a closed door or even a
Yeah.
wall,
Mhm.
because we're like, well, these aren't, that can't possibly be the way to go. And I would say it's a data point, but it's
Mhm.
not the full story. And so that can help us begin to identify rather than just saying immediately, I know you talk a lot about red flags, rather than just saying immediately, like, this is a red flag, don't go this way. Consider, what if it's a yellow flag? And then I can begin to say, well, is this a wall? Don't go this way. Is it a window inviting me to say, here's something that could be possible on the other side? Is it a
Mhm.
mirror that's saying, maybe it's some time for some self reflection? Or might it be a door and
Yeah.
maybe it is time to walk through it?
Yeah. Yeah. So good. And it's interesting because the way that I navigate a lot of the work that I do is underneath a somatic lens, which is
Mm.
learning the language of your body. It's
Yeah,
understanding how to speak the language of your nervous system. And so I think that it's what you're inviting people into and saying all of this is start to get curious about that.
yeah,
Start to understand because you're right. When fear shows up, when anger shows up, when sadness shows up, it doesn't always mean that it's something that is wrong
that's
and
right.
something that right? It's being able to discern and be with those big emotions in your body and get really getting you're saying get curious about them,
That's right.
which is so
That's right.
big.
Mm.
So big. So in that same line, we talk about regret. So I know that, personally, and I again, not to keep coming back to my story, but I'm in exactly what you're talking about right now. And I was having this conversation yesterday. Oftentimes when I gave the analogy that this program that I have is in a box and the box is starting to come apart, right? It's starting to fall apart and I am over here trying to duct tape the box and super glue it and keep it together because I have so much regret of letting it go and potentially making the wrong choice and I can recognize it, right? But there's still this sense of anticipated regret
Mm.
of what could happen if I let this thing go. So, and I know that a lot of my listeners struggle with this. They struggle with what do I do if I know I need to leave a relationship or I know I need to exit a business situation or leave a friendship? How do people navigate that anticipated regret of potentially making the wrong choice, of when to stay, when to go, and navigating that entire kind of cesspool of emotions that shows up?
Anticipated regret is a powerful force. It can keep us in spaces way longer than we want to be there, way longer than we ought to be there, because just as you said, we're afraid to make a move in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
And I think first I would say, just because you've prayed for something, wanted something, worked for something, and earned something, um, if something begins to change with whatever that something is, whether it's a relationship or a degree or a vocation or a community, if something begins to change there, it's good to begin to explore why.
Mm,
I think sometimes we don't even allow ourselves to explore why because we feel guilty
mm,
because this is something I deeply wanted at one time. And we think that I wanted it then, so and anyone else would look at this and would just be so envious of what I have and how could I possibly consider even letting it go? And so we don't consider it. And this is back to our intention of courage, of remembering that, okay, I'm not necessarily making a move right now, but let's, as you said, get curious. And I think a second thing to remember is just because it might not be right anymore doesn't mean it was never right at all.
so
In
big.
the past, I may have needed, I mean, I'll just use something generic. I may have needed green. Like green was the thing I needed to nourish me, and that's what I knew at the time. But as I'm growing and learning and meeting new people and expanding my view of all the things, maybe I need red now. And it
Mm,
doesn't mean green was bad. It just means something has changed. Maybe
yeah.
I have changed. And so I think that those two things of recognizing that it's okay to ask the questions. It doesn't mean you're betraying something. It doesn't mean you're betraying yourself. It might feel that way, but getting curious about, wow, that's interesting. I'm noticing that I'm feeling like I'm betraying myself
Mm,
rather than saying, I'm someone who betrays, that it doesn't have to become part of our identity. And that's a third thing I would say is this idea of I'm so big about naming what is true. There's a writer, a Catholic priest who says, Father Ronald Rolheiser talks about how we get into trouble whenever we don't name things properly.
mm,
And sometimes naming it feels like this little small first step, but sometimes when you name it and call it, it's like, oh, actually, I'm 50% there.
yeah.
Oh, that's all I needed to do. And so just recognizing and naming that um, this space might not be for me anymore. And I might not know why yet, but at least I've introduced it into the room. And now I can have a conversation with it and determine what my next step might be.
Yeah. So big. And being able to, it's funny because we as humans, we're meaning making creatures.
Yeah.
That's what creates us and makes us so different than anything else that walks on the planet is that ability to make meaning. But I think what you're saying which is really beautiful, Emily, is that there's this dance between meaning and curiosity. It's like
Yeah.
we can give something meaning and we can also be really curious about, you know what, this doesn't have to mean something about me. It's just what's happening.
Yes,
And I'm
sometimes
not
there is
going.
no story. Sometimes it just
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
And now we navigate what is with what we know at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think gives people permission. It's that permission because oftentimes we're, and you're right, societally and the way that we've all been conditioned and raised, we are in this space of feeling like everything has to have meaning. Nobody has invited us into that dance of curiosity of, you know what? Because this is not right any longer, that doesn't mean that it means something about you.
Yeah.
But also, let's just name what's true about it and also get curious around what's next. And so I love that. I feel like that's so tangible to give people permission to play in that sandbox, if you will, of the
Yeah.
curiosity and the meaning making.
And I think to add on to that, something to pay attention to for ourselves is naming what our own narratives are around staying or leaving.
Mm,
Because a lot of us make our decisions, we stop short of curiosity because we've decided long ago based on our own family of origin, our cultural conditioning, our social location, we all have ideas and ingrained beliefs about what it means to be a stayer and what it means to be a leaver. And depending on who you are, they're positive, negative, or neutral either way. So not all staying is good, not all staying is bad. It's fascinating when you think about how we can all be in the same room together and we can all have the same shared experience of something, but we did not have the same experience because
yeah.
we showed up with our own narratives. And so getting curious about, well, what do I think about, leaving? Would I call that brave or would I call that lacking commitment?
Mm.
Depends on who you are.
Yeah, so big. So, so big. I was having a conversation with a friend last week who she's a therapist and she is having that very same curiosity conversation with herself because her, growing up in her family of origin, she grew up in a pretty abusive household with a mother who was an alcoholic. And so leaving felt like betraying the family.
Yeah,
And so now here she is as an adult, and she tends to stay in relationships when they've died and she knows she needs to exit because leaving equals abandoning someone. And so
right.
it's so important to look at those stories that you've created. And people know if they listen to the podcast, I'm always talking about go back, look at look at your core wounds. Where did it come from? What family dynamics and generational dynamics are creating the way that you show up in partnership now? So I think that that's really important to kind of hone in on. So I'm curious, I know that we've kind of talked overview, but what simple steps can you give someone to, if they're in that space of needing to really tap into courage when they know it's time to leave? So this is actually speaking directly to my friend that I just spoke about. When they know it's the right choice, but they just can't leave. What
Hmm.
simple steps can you give someone so they can kind of start to build that courage in themselves?
I'm so glad you mentioned looking back. I'm such a fan of reflection. Like, how can we possibly move forward before we've looked back? I have no idea. People do it all the time, I hear, but that's just not my way. But I think it can be very basic. There are four kind of movements that I like to point to when it comes to discerning if it's time, or even once you've discerned it is time, but you don't know how to make that first move. And the first we've sort of already covered, which is pointing and calling. It's pointing at what's true and calling it out loud, naming the thing, whatever it is, for what it is. I think about life in some ways. I use the metaphor of life is like a house, and every room holds a story. And so,
Mm,
as you are considering the various rooms of your life, and that can be a physical room or a metaphorical room, point and call it what's there. Turn on the lights. What do you see? And there are questions we can ask ourselves in those spaces to begin to get a true evaluation of what's there. But if you've already done that step and you're like, here's what's true, here's the red flags, I see them, I know them, it's time for me to go, but I'm still scared. Well, the second movement would be to remember your path. Really, we're always only standing at the start. We imagine that our life is sort of like we're walking down a path and there's this like really clear path ahead of us and we're trying to figure out which way is the right way. But in reality, the path is behind us. There are poets who have written about this. And so, first, we have to get clear and remember Where have I already come from?
Mm.
And when did I make a decision to leave or to walk in, to leave a room or walk into a room? And what happened there? And did I die or not? Am I still okay? And remembering what we've already survived and what we've already gone through. And maybe we did it all kinds of sloppy ways. Maybe we did the best we could at the time, but we've learned now. And maybe we want to begin to name, as we look back on our path, those goodbyes that I've already said. What was beautiful about those spaces I said goodbye to? Not villainize them, but see
Mhm.
them. There were some good things. That's why I was there, probably. But now, and so, but what are the gifts I'm going to take with me when I leave those spaces? And looking back and like blessing the past goodbyes we've already had, and even saying, what are the things I left behind? And I think practicing blessing your past goodbyes can help us remember that we're going to be able to do that again. We're going to be able to name what was there, to take what we need for our journey, and to leave the rest behind. The third movement I would encourage is to acknowledge presence. Every room we enter, we do not go alone. We bring ourselves. We can be our own friend. We bring spirit with us. However, you talk about God, I talk about, God as spirit, and God comes with me in every room I enter. We bring people who love us and know us. We bring people who have gone before us, our ancestors. These are all, there is presence that we bring with us in every room we enter. We do not go alone. And that can be a comfort to know. I don't know what I'm walking into, but I know what I've left, but I do know that something new is always waiting.
Mm.
And then the final thing that I would say, and this is more of an action, is okay, now that we've looked at all that, what is just my next right thing?
Mm.
And this is yielding to the arrows, which, by the way, these four movements spell out the word pray, which can help us remember point and call, remember your path, acknowledge presence, and yield to the arrows. What's just one next right thing? Today might not be the day to make the breakup call or have the breakup conversation, but you might know it's coming. So, what can you do today to prepare you to get you one step closer to being ready to make that final call, knowing that when you walk out of this room, you do not walk out alone.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, so good. So, so good. I feel like we could do individual podcast episodes on each one of those,
Yeah, right.
each one of those bullet points. And it's so true. I was having a real conversation with myself last night. And actually, my boyfriend called me out on it too. And just saying, it's so easy for us to get caught up in the end goal and to
Yeah,
feel like this is where we need to be. We know that we need to be here. But what you're saying is, how can you just take that next right step? And that is so big because I feel like a lot of people don't hear that. And they're always thinking about what is this end goal? How do I get there as soon as possible? And what you're
right.
saying is, wait a second. No, what's just the tiny step that you can make towards that end goal, which gives people, honestly, it makes my nervous system feel like it can breathe.
Beautiful. It is so inefficient.
Mhm.
Discernment can be an inefficient process, but it can also be a life-giving one, and it lets us move at a human pace. And I think to your point earlier asking about anticipated regret, when we take our time and name and go through these movements at a walking pace, I think it can give us the courage and confidence we need later when we look back and we do start to inevitably question ourselves and wonder like, but that was a good thing and I let it go. But we can say, but no, but I walked, but I took my time and I answered the questions and I paid attention to my life and I listened to my life. Parker Palmer talks about listen to what your life wants to do with you before you tell your life what you're going to do with it. And I
Mm.
think that's such an important practice. And that can be a comfort to us 6 months down the road when we
Yeah.
start inevitably questioning all of our decisions.
Right. Yeah. So helpful. So helpful. Everyone, if you are listening, rewind and jot those down. But also, I know, and I'm hoping that you have a book coming out on March 12th, How to Walk into a Room. Is that part of the book that is coming out that you're speaking?
Yes,
Can you just tell
ma'am.
us about the book? Tell
It
us about
is. Well, really, everything we've been talking about is really the book. It's called How to Walk into a Room. It's all about the art, not a science, the art of knowing when to stay and when to walk away.
it.
We've been doing this our whole lives. We should all have master's degrees in staying and leaving. We've been doing it all the time. but sometimes we feel like we're still flailing our way through these big grown up life decisions. And so I wanted to have a conversation via a book, or at least begin a conversation so that you can have it with your friends and family and people to begin to really discover, okay, how do I know when the time is right? What questions can I ask myself in order to begin to discern that? What red flags should I be looking for? Which ones might I be able to ignore? What do I do when an ending comes, but there's no closure? What do I do when I'm ready to leave, but it's not time? Or what do I do when it's time to leave and I don't feel ready? These are the types of things that I wanted to explore and dive into. And I share some of my own stories, some of my own rooms that I've left as well. But I'm thrilled this book is coming out into the world, and I do think it is a great conversation starter for anyone who has any of those questions that they're carrying, in their various spaces, the various rooms of their lives.
I love it. I love it. And we are going to post in the show notes below how you can get your hands on Emily's book. So make sure that you check out the show notes. So I'm so excited to read your book, Emily. It sounds
Yay!
like it's going to be, and also to recommend it. I have a recommended reading list for all of my clients, and it sounds like it's going to be one that's going to go on the list.
Oh yes, let's go.
Yeah, I love it so much. So there's one question that I like to ask every person that comes on the Align Love podcast. And I love it because I get such different answers, but the core of the answers is usually always the same. So I'm curious for you, what does it mean to be in an aligned relationship?
What a beautiful question, Lauren. I would expect nothing less from you. I think that two things come to mind. One is when I'm in a relationship where the other person honors my own spiritual personality, meaning how I connect with God. They honor it, they respect it, they leave space for it, and they help me, maybe even challenge me in it. So that's one. And the second is being in an aligned relationship for me looks like someone who does the same thing for my own core values. That when I am in this with this partner, with this person in conversation or whatever it is, that I know that I am not going to be violating my own inner core values
Mm,
by engaging in relationship with them. And to me, when those things are true, um, things feel aligned. It just
yeah.
feels wholehearted. And I hope to be the type of presence to be able to do that for someone else as well.
I love it. I love it. So good. Every time I ask that question, it blows me away, the answer. So thank you so much. So before we kind of wrap up for today, Emily, I would love for people to know how they can find you. I know we talked about your book. Again, that's going to be in the show notes below. But also, can you just tell people what's next for you and how can they get a hold of you if they want to follow you and carry along on your book journey too?
I'm Emily P. Freeman, most places, Instagram and website. So you can find me there. Instagram is probably my social media of choice. I also host a weekly podcast called The Next Right Thing. And so that episodes come out every Tuesday. So you can find me there. And then third, I have a weekly Substack newsletter called The Soul Minimalist. And so that's where we kind of take the conversation started on the podcast and bring it into a different format, a different medium for those who want to go deeper than the pro con list when it
Mm,
comes to making decisions in the areas of faith, work, and life. And so that's where we have a little bit deeper conversations on the Soul Minimalist Weekly. So those are my places, and I would love to meet you there.
I love it. Emily, thank you so much for coming on the show. And make sure, everybody, if you are listening, that you check out the show notes below for all of those links. They will all be there. Emily, thank you again so much. We can't wait to have you on again soon.
Thanks, Lauren.
That wraps up today's episode of the Aligned Love podcast. One thing that would really help me and the other new potential listeners is for you to rate this show and leave a comment wherever you tune in and listen. Also, make sure to link up with me on Instagram at Lauren Zoller, and please share this podcast with anyone who you think may enjoy it. Until next episode, remember, every transformation begins with one moment of awareness, and I hope today has been yours. I'll see you next time.